Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and for today's environmental session, we're happy to have Dr. Kevin Svatana with us. Kevin is a professor in the Department of Biology and Earth Sciences at Otterbein University in Westerville, Ohio. He received a bachelor's degree from Juanita College in Huntington, Pennsylvania in 1981, master's from West Virginia University in '83, and a PhD from the Ohio State University in '05. And this session is titled Brownfield Redevelopment, also known as land recycling. This presentation describes the history of environmental impacts that led to a category of properties known as brownfields. These are potentially impaired properties where former waste management practices may have created real or perceived impacts which may limit development potential. I do ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Svatana.
Hi, and thank you for coming. As John said, I'm a professor at Otterbein University. We're in Westerville, which is a suburb of Columbus, if you're not that familiar with where we're at. And I also do consulting work with BSI, British Standards Institute, which is where I do most of the brownfield science that I do. So what I want to talk about today is a category of properties that were kind of a byproduct, an unintended consequence of the hazardous waste regulations that were enacted in the mid-'70s and then became fully enforced in the 1980s, things like Superfund, stuff like that. So if we look up a definition, if we want to start with a definition, brownfields are abandoned, idled, or underused industrial or commercial sites where expansion, redevelopment is complicated by real, and I want to emphasize perceived, environmental contamination that can add cost, time, and uncertainty to redevelopment projects. And brownfields are often remnants of factory closures, failed businesses, obsolete products like the buggy whip. There are certain things like, they changed how brakes were made for cars, so the way they made those, they had to retool factories. Things like that often cause that. And this is actually Johnstown, Pennsylvania. I'm going to come back to that for an example to kind of show you what some of the larger impacts are. So let's go back in history a little bit and figure out what caused these brownfields. As I said, they were an unintended consequence where a lot of them came from, they're related to the boom of the electrochemical industry. And Cleveland actually was kind of a center for that. Buffalo, New York, Niagara Falls, definitely the center of it. The electrochemical industry originated in the late 1900s when Cruikshanks was able to take electricity, take high voltage, and start making chemicals from that. And the very simplest was they would take salt brine and disassociate it with a positive and a negative induced current onto it, and that would make sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid. So now you have a strong acid, strong base, you can start doing things, okay? And that led to starting to experiment with other chemicals to try to make them more beneficial, to make them better than what they were. And the example I list here is originally if you use dry cleaning, and looking at the folks in this room, most of you probably had something dry cleaned at some point in time, so you're familiar with the dry cleaning process. In the 1950s, if you use dry cleaning, they used mineral spirits, the same thing you'd use to clean an oil-based paintbrush, okay? And the problem with mineral spirits is it catches on fire. So if you have an open spark, you got a fire, so it's a problem. So what they did is they took this chemical ethane, a hydrocarbon gas, and they removed the hydrogens electrochemically and infused chlorine, and it had the same properties as mineral spirits. So it would dissolve oils. You could get it so it wouldn't have an odor to it, which if you really distill mineral spirits heavily, you can get the odors out of the mineral spirits too. And the thing now, is, instead of having hydrogens, you put this chlorine on, chlorine doesn't really have a flash point. So you took away the flammability. So that's the application of the perchloroethylene to dry cleaning. But now let's look at the auto manufacturing. You take the hood of a car, right? You stamp it, and that's how you form the shape of the hood. Well, you need an oil film on the metal. The metal's coming off of a great big roll, so you need an oil film on there. You stamp it so that the oil actually allows the stamp to work a little bit better. Now you want to take that and paint it. Well, you can't put paint on an oily surface. So you can use the perchloroethylene or trichloroethylene to take that off. So this stuff was like a godsend. Before, they would actually use gasoline or mineral spirits for that, and fires were a risk. They were a hazard. So you take that out of the equation. Now you're getting this fluid because when it's mixed with the oil, it doesn't work as well, so you just take it out back, okay? And keep in mind, industry at this time is shifting from large population centers to rural towns. A couple of reasons. One, space, because you can go outside of a town like Mansfield, or one of the other cities in middle of Ohio, and you can buy a farm that's 120 acres. You need 20 acres to put your plant, to actually build the physical plant. The rest of that is where you get rid of stuff, okay? The rest of the acreage. So if you have the spent perchloroethylene, you just toss it out back. There's no regulations in the 1950s, 1960s. That's perfectly legal. Then in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. Now, the scientists in the environmental arena knew what these chemicals were doing to the environment. They knew that perchloroethylene got into the environment, didn't readily break down, and it's also a carcinogen, okay? So Rachel Carson was the first one to write a science-based book for the general public to make them aware of what was going on. And that book, Silent Spring, really opened up a lot of people's eyes, and it started that environmental awareness that most people are familiar with in the 1970s, and it led to a whole string of legislation being passed. One of them was known as the Comprehensive Environmental Compensation Liability Act that had a shorter and easier to remember name of Superfund, okay? And some of you may have heard of Superfund sites. There's literally thousands of them scattered across the US. And to give you an idea of what the mind thought was in the 1970s, they thought that by 1995, they wouldn't need the Superfund program, that they'd have these sites cleaned up and would be done, okay? And the funding was only pushed forward to that point. Now, it's been extended since then, but the reality is here in 2024, they're still adding sites to the Superfund list faster than they're closing them, okay? So this was a much bigger problem than people understood. The next part of this is vagueness of environmental laws and policies. There was a court case that involved Maryland Trust, Maryland Bank and Trust, where they had a mortgage on a farm property outside the DC area in Maryland, okay, Rockville, Maryland. And the bank foreclosed on the farmer, and then they started building housing because you're in the DC commuting distance. So when they started digging foundations, they found out that the farmer had a little side business that he was doing. He was taking drums from local industries, digging pits on the farm fields and burying them. Okay? The reason that this is important, because the bank basically said, not my problem. Went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, yeah, you foreclosed on them. It's now your problem. So that caused the precedent of enforcement on lending agencies, and it created this whole new wave of professionals that do due diligence in the environmental arena. And that's part of what brought around the brownfield sites, because the average public, when you start talking about pollution, they have a natural fear of it, okay? When you see something like perchloroethylene or methylene dichlorate, you just assume it's bad, right? It may not be, but you may assume that it's bad. And if you were in one of these, if you had one of these properties, there was no voluntary, flexible way to do a cleanup. You were stuck in either the CERCLA, if it was that bad, or the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, known as RCRA. And these are pretty rigid environmental rules to comply with. So, and the other two images I have here, this is Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach, Missouri, this was actually not too different from what Lakeside is. It was kind of a summer resort area along the Missouri River, one of the main tributaries of the Mississippi. And they didn't have paved streets. They had dirt roads to keep the dust down. They had somebody come in and oil the roads, which was a common practice. Unfortunately, the guy who was getting the oil was getting it from Monsanto, who was also making dioxin-laced Agent Orange for the Vietnam War. So they ended up spreading dioxin on the roads. Rain would come along, the oil goes into the grass. The horses came and ate the grass, the horses died. Super fun sight. Okay? This is Love Canal up in New York. I was just up there about a month ago, and there are probably 24 Superfund sites in Niagara Falls, that immediate area. And Love Canal is the one there. The quick history of it, somebody had a failed real estate venture. They were trying to dig a canal to connect the upper falls to the lower falls. They were going to have this thing called Model City along the canal. The guy went bankrupt after he had about a mile of trench excavated. It sat there for decades. The chemical industry, the electrochemical industry, which was really centered up around the falls, Niagara Falls, they needed a place to dump things. There's an open pit. They dumped them. Then the city of Niagara Falls was growing. They wanted land to build a school and a housing development. They bought the property, and the rest of it's kind of history. Okay? Ended up with a lot of serious problems, children with deformities, excessive amounts of cancer, et cetera. So that was the Love Canal. So let me go back to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Once upon a time, there was a steel company known as Bethlehem Steel. They were one of the major steel producers in the U.S. They're gone now. They're bankrupt. But in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, their facility took up a lot of real estate. And if you're familiar with the geography of Johnstown, so you have plateau, hill, valley. The really valuable real estate is the valley, okay? Johnstown's legacy is they had two disastrous floods, one in the 1870s and then one in 1977 that wiped out pretty much the whole downtown area. But the backbone of Johnstown was this big steel mill where they made rolling steel and they also made railroad cars at that. It employed about 3,000 to 4,000 people. That's where the tax base came from for the city of Johnstown. Well, Bethlehem Steel went out of business in the early 1900s. And if you get a sense, this is Johnstown. This is the footprint taken up by the facility. It's been vacant since they closed, okay, since the early 90s. And in 2022, nothing's really changed. Buildings are loaded with a lot of contaminants, asbestos, the chlorinated solvents that I was talking about before, very expensive to clean up. Bethlehem Steel's gone. There's nobody there to hold. That's the only way you get out of a Superfund is declare bankruptcy, okay? So this has been sitting there idle, but the main part of this that I want to stress is when buildings are empty for a period of time, what happens to them? They start to leak and they start to deteriorate. So these things have been sitting there for almost 30 years now, deteriorating. The asbestos issues get worse because the asbestos starts to become friable. And those 30,000 people that used to pay taxes to keep the schools and the water lines and the schools running, they're gone. This town has never recovered from that, and they've never really come up with a good solution of how to redevelop this. And that's really what brought the brownfield regulations in place. The federal government in 1994 said, we've created a problem. We have all these properties that nobody wants to touch because there's a cost associated with trying to clean them up. It's easier to go buy a farm field and build something than to go back in and try to fix these. So in 1994, EPA decided they were going to mandate each state come up with their own voluntary programs to kind of foster these, and there would be some type of funding mechanism, and I'll get to that a little bit, and I'll talk about Ohio's. The problem with some of these is they're complicated. If you look at a team that works on this, these are some of the skill sets you have to have: chemists, toxicologists, geologists, soil scientists, biologists, economic specialists, engineers, planners, and regulatory specialists. You got to figure out all these pieces and parts to try to put it together. So evaluating a brownfield site, you have to figure out what could be there. Keep in mind, some of these places closed down in the 70s. There's not much records. How do you know what they did? Well, if you look at certain industries, you can kind of guess what type of chemicals they used. So you use that as kind of a starting point. And that's one of the really challenging parts of these type of projects, because there's some detective work you have to do to try to figure out what the problem is, okay? So you have to figure out the contaminants, and related to that, you have to know the dose and the toxicity. You have to know the mobility of the contaminants. What do I mean by mobility? Something like PCBs absorbs into soils and pretty much stays where it gets spilled or released. Think about salt. You put salt down on the roads in the wintertime to keep them open. Where's the salt go? Basically, once you get a rainfall or you get a snow melt, it ends up in the streams and it ends up in the Gulf or the oceans. Okay, so we're just basically recycling it back through again. So those are the salt is very mobile. The PCB that I referenced is not. And then the next part is exposure pathway. How does that contaminant get to somebody or an ecological receptor? And then trying to figure out how do you eliminate those pathways. And some of the things I'll talk about are engineering controls. This is the really big challenge. And the site I'm going to talk about in detail, which is in Columbus, it required a lot of forward thinking. You have to really be able to envision what a site can be with all the limitations that this stuff adds to it, okay? Let me talk a little bit about toxins. So I have this children's toothpaste. That's fine, right? Well, if I click on that sodium monofluorophosphate, it's going to tell me that if a young child, 2 years old, ingests that whole container of toothpaste, you probably should get them to the hospital because that's too much of that particular compound, okay? Read the labels on it, and you'll see that. The next thing I have on there is coal tar. If you have dry skin, if you have dandruff, you may buy a shampoo that actually has coal tar in it. Now, I have this young guy here with the brush. Anybody know what he does for a living? Chimney sweep. First connection of a profession and a toxic reaction, okay? Exposure. All right, so this young guy, you're thinking back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, everybody heats their homes with either wood or coal. It leaves a residue in the chimney, and that residue will actually build up over time, and it can actually catch on fire and cause the flue fire and cause a house to burn down. So you needed to clean the chimney. The easy way to do it is they would hire these young guys, and most of them would go down through the chimney with the brush, cleaning. And because when they did that, the mortar of the chimney bricks, they get stuck. So they'd take their clothes off and go down without any clothes on. That way they wouldn't get stuck and they wouldn't tear their clothes. So they were getting this creosote, this black stuff, which is the same thing as coal tar. They were getting it all over their body. By the time they're 21 years old, they have skin cancer to the point where it would kill them before they were 30. And it was dose and exposure, okay? But if you put in the appropriate dose, like you do with this shampoo, and you follow the directions, not a problem, okay? And of course, you've heard the marketing from personal injury law firms now about Roundup and things like that, of your exposure to some of the modern chemicals as well. So we talk about dose and toxicity. It's how much you can tolerate. Caffeine's an easy example. So if we talk about caffeine, you have a cup of coffee in the morning, probably fine. You have 6 cups of coffee, all of a sudden your heart starts getting a little funny, right? Because you're overdosing yourself, okay? I'll use another example that I use with the college kids because somehow they seem to relate to it. We talk about alcohol. So I'll tell them, okay, you got whiskey, and you take a shot glass and you sip on that whiskey just a little bit over an 8-hour period. What do you feel like? And of course, most of them aren't 21 yet, so I expect them to say, I don't know, but I get different responses. So, but most of them will say, oh, a shot glass, 8 hours, that's nothing, right? So, okay, let's change the dose. Shot glass every hour, 8 hours. Some of them will now say, ooh, yeah, I shouldn't drive at that point. Then I take it a step higher and I say, what if you just pop the top off the whiskey bottle and chug it as fast as you can? Most of them that know what's going to happen are like, ooh, give me that kind of response, because I tell them, if you don't throw up, you might die. That's dose and toxicity, and that's what we have to understand to do that. So I've gotten through that. The pathway is how things move to get to a receptor. And where do you find this? Well, there's these things called safety data sheets. So if you buy something at the hardware store, like paint thinner, let's just say you buy mineral spirits. When you check out, technically they're supposed to, if you ask for a safety data sheet, they're supposed to be able to hand you one. Now, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, they may or may not know that. It depends on whether they've been trained. But you can also put the product name online with safety data sheet, and you'll get one. And then that has everything you need to know, particularly related to the toxicity and all of how flammable it is, et cetera. So that data does exist out there. And then there's the ATSDR, Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease. That's part of the CDC, and they have toxicological profiles on most chemicals that you can look up too. All right, so let's talk about fate and transport and pathways to receptors. So this cartoon is basically showing a scenario. So if we're going to have an exposure route, we're going to think humans here at first. If we're going to have an exposure route, you can ingest it, inhale it, or have direct contact. Ingestion in your mouth. Inhalation, breathing it in, direct contact, getting it on your skin. So let's look at the cartoon. This is methyl ethyl ethyl, some generic chemical, okay? Think of it as gasoline. So it's a liquid. It can soak into the ground, but it can also evaporate. So gasoline's a good analogy to use. If this person walks over to that, what might be the potential exposure routes? Inhalation, because you get close enough, it's evaporating. You could breathe it, okay? Curious, go over and touch it. It's on your skin, okay? And how about ingestion? Well, that shows an adult. What if it's a 6-year-old? Maybe you do get ingestion after they touch it to see what it feels like, okay? So those are the pathways here. Now, if it soaks into the ground, part of it can travel as a vapor to this basement, and it can actually come into the vapor, or the vapor can actually come into the basement, okay? There it can be inhaled. That's called vapor intrusion. Some of it can make its way to the water table, where this house actually has an on-site well. The well pulls in the water. What pathways does that person get? Ingestion if they drink the water, inhalation from the aeration of the water from the faucet, direct contact, okay? So what you have to do is analyze this fate and transport and figure out how do you break the pathways. Now, they put Bessie on here, so I got to address that too, because we have to think ecological. The corn could actually absorb up some of that vapor and it could go into the corn, into Bessie, into Bessie's milk. Okay? So that's an ecological to human exposure. All right? Bessie can inhale it, another exposure pathway. Okay? So understanding this site conceptual model is a pretty important part of how you come up with a plan to actually fix these things. So part of the chemical characteristics and contaminants, you have to think about the phase. Are they solid, liquid, or gas? I've already talked about the salt. It goes down as a solid, you get a rainfall, it becomes a liquid, and it kind of goes off into other parts of the environment, right? The gasoline, if you spill it on a hot day, it's going to evaporate pretty readily. It's going to go from liquid to gas. So you have to think about how phase change affects that. Solubility. Everybody knows oil is not soluble in water, right? We'll come back to that. Density. Is it lighter than water, or does it sink through water? Get to that in a minute, too. Absorbance. Does it stick to stuff, or does it tend not to partition and just keep moving with the water? And then half-life. Gasoline, fortunately, has a short half-life. It doesn't last that long in the subsurface. But that PCE that I was talking about earlier and the PCBs that I referenced earlier, those things last for decades. In fact, PCBs, we really don't even know the half-life yet, because even though they've been in the marketplace for getting close to 100 years now, they really haven't shown any breakdown naturally. Okay, so they have a very long half-life. Light non-aqueous phase liquids, those are your oils and your gasolines. When they leak, they go through the unsaturated zone, accumulate on top of the water table, and then they partially dissolve. Then we have the opposite of that, are the dense non-aqueous phase liquids. That's the dry cleaning fluid, the perchloroethylene I was talking about before. This is why this stuff has been around. I've worked on cleanup sites for 30 years, and we're nowhere close to being done yet. In fact, I always tell my students, you know, your generation's going to keep working on some of the sites that I started. And that's because this stuff goes down into the water table. It's more dense than water, and it keeps going down till it hits some type of a permeability barrier, and then it moves out laterally. It pancakes out laterally. And what happens is, this is a blow-up. These are the individual grains of soil. And because these will preferentially wet a surface, that red would be the chemical, and it's wetting the surface. And to try to explain how this works, how many people have ever fried bacon in a skillet? Okay. If you just take cold water, can you get the bacon grease out of the skillet? Why? Because the bacon grease preferentially wet the skillet and the water won't displace it. How do you get your skillet clean? Well, you put in dish detergent like Dawn. It changes the wetting angle of the water and allows it to lift the grease off the surface, and that's how you get it clean, okay? So underground, you don't have the Dawn, so this stuff just sits there, and every time water goes by, groundwater goes by, it dissolves a little bit of that away, which is coming back to the partial solubility example. So benzene is one of the chemicals in gasoline. We all get exposed. If you're pumping gas and you smell it, you've been exposed to benzene, okay? Benzene's in the gasoline. So benzene solubility is very low. If I put benzene in a container with water, it looks like it's going to make a layer on top and not mix, right? But some of it, 1,750 milligrams per liter, will actually dissolve in the water. So if I put a layer of gasoline on top of water in a container and I can pull a sample off the water, it's going to be saturated with that concentration. The drinking water standard, the maximum contaminant level for benzene is 0.005 milligrams per liter. You see how just a little bit creates a big problem, okay? So that's what the partial solubility does. All right, let's talk a little bit now. So I've laid out some of the science behind this, the strategy, which is trying to characterize a site and then come up with a way of breaking pathways. Let's talk a little bit about how Ohio came about to work with its brownfields. So in '94, when the feds said, each state, you got to come up with your own program, Ohio kind of did the same thing as Connecticut, and then some other states fell in place, like Massachusetts, New Jersey, North Carolina. And they decided to come up with a voluntary action program, and this is Ohio Administrative Code 3745-300, so that's, if you want to look them up, that's where they are. And what they did in Ohio is they recognized professionals who work in the business, and they can become certified professionals by applying to Ohio EPA, and you have to demonstrate your experience and your education, et cetera. And if you become a certified professional, you're actually an extension of Ohio EPA. Certified professionals in Ohio can do a no further action letter, which means the site has cleaned up enough to be redeveloped with whatever restrictions are on it, okay? Other states, the agency is the governing body. But in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Ohio, citizens with the appropriate experience can serve in that role. Okay, so how do you evaluate a brownfield site? Phase one. This is a non-intrusive, non-sampling. You're reviewing records and you're trying to determine, did they do something at the site that could have created an environmental release? Did they have underground storage tanks? Did they use chemicals that were shipped on site in drums? So you go look and see where the delivery area would be. You'd try to figure out how they used them in the process, and if there was some waste byproduct, where would they have dumped it? One of the most common places to look when you jump to a phase two, wherever the maintenance shop was, find the closest back door. Because somebody cleans a paintbrush with mineral spirits, where are they going to get rid of that coffee can of mineral spirits? Back door. Perfectly legal in the 70s and even into the early 80s. So if the phase one says, yes, there's a potential, you move on to phase two. Phase two is sampling, delineation, and assessing the standards. So you identify, you have these potential identified areas. That's where the space behind the, oh yeah, I can say that one seems, okay. Yeah, I got a point. So you have these identified areas, that space outside the back door of the maintenance, that would be one of the potential identified areas. Then what are the contaminants? You get an understanding of their dose and toxicity. The mobility, are they going to stay in place? Are they going to move large distances? Exposure pathways and eliminating pathways. And what these photographs are showing, at Otterbein, I created a well field on campus that I use for teaching. And since I interact with Ohio EPA quite a bit, they're like, can we use that for a training ground for a hydrogeologist? I said, sure. So, at one point in time, Ohio EPA had their own drill rigs, and their folks had equipment to go out and do sampling on site. So they did their own training using Otterbein facilities, and I had one little catch. My students got to shadow them. And it was great because they got to know who people were in Ohio EPA. They end up getting internships from it. It was very much a win-win. And this last part on here, envisioning what a site can become. That's really important. As part of the assessment, you have to come up with ways of doing remediation. So this is actually up in Cleveland. Whoops, I want to use this one. This is actually recovering oil. This is absorbent that I developed a process for, and we're actually recovering oil out of a well there. This is one where we're injecting chemicals to break down the chemicals in the ground to basically destroy them in place, okay? So that's what we call injection, or ISCO. And then this was actually the site in West Virginia. These three tanks are the ones that had the MCHM that got into the Elk River and contaminated the water in the Kanawha River. And if you remember back in 2014, Charleston, West Virginia, in January, had no water for 30 days for over 300 people. And I got pulled in as an expert on that particular site. This is when they started dismantling the tanks. So let's talk about brownfield success. We have the layout. Let's see what some of these things can become. So if you're from Columbus and you're familiar with downtown, this is Miranova. So this is a building where the first floors of this sold for about $1 million in 1998, okay? Fred Reichert, the guy that owned Reichert Ford at the time, bought the first floor on that. And if you look, there's a parking garage at the bottom. That's because there's volatile chemicals in the soil. The parking garage allows the chemicals to come up and evaporate and not get into the living space, okay? So this is one of the first success stories. Then if you're familiar with Columbus, this is the Smith Brothers hardware store. That was full of asbestos and it had certain things in the soil. It's now office buildings because they remediate it, but they preserved the building. And this is one of the early ones to go through the voluntary action program. If you look directly north of where this is, this was the old Jeffrey mining site. This was heavily contaminated. It floundered for a couple decades, but now it's starting to fill in. You can see there's some housing going in there. Ohio State's invested a couple of properties in there. There's a parking garage associated with it. So it's starting to actually fill in, and I'm just trying to connect the church spire to the church spire, the Wonder Bread to the Wonder Bread Tower to kind of give you a perspective of how that's changing. Columbus Convention Center. I originally was from Pennsylvania. This was my first trip in the 1980s to Ohio, and it was basically to go work on this particular site. This green dashed line, that's the CSX main line. Where this building exists here, that was a rail yard. Rail yards are notorious because back in the day, when the engines that ran on diesel to run a generator to make the wheels turn, when it got really cold, they idled those all the time, but if it got really cold and the fuel might gel, instead of ruining the engine, the diesel engines, they had controls on there to basically dump the fuel. So it wasn't uncommon for 1,000 gallons of fuel on a cold night just to get dumped. And rail yards were the thing where you could go out and drill a hole in the ground. It was like you hit the mother lode. You felt like Jed Clampett for a couple minutes. So, but that's a brownfield site as well. What else do we have in Columbus? Well, there's the old Crew Stadium. This was Columbus Auto Parts. This was a pretty heavily contaminated, and Lowe's is one of the companies that actually looks for brownfields to redevelop. And what Lowe's did, there's contamination out here that they didn't want to put the building on top of. So they put the parking lot out front and they moved the building back. Originally, they wanted the building out front because you can see it off of 71 here. But they moved it back, and this is now that pavement is a barrier. It's mostly lead that's in there. The pavement is a barrier that protects the shopper and the employees from the contaminated soils. And since this went through the VAP program, a CP has to certify the condition of that pavement every year, because if it starts to deteriorate where it's not protecting anymore, Lowe's has to close, okay? And that's all part of the agreement. And then New Crew Stadium, which is known as Lower Field, here, there's the new stadium. There's the baseball stadium. That's where the Clippers developed the current Guardians. That was all a brownfield as well. That was an industrial area. In fact, this was a coal tar plant right there where the baseball field is. They dug down 14 feet, filled it back in to where the playing surface is to be able to protect the baseball players and the folks attending the game. Promo Park is right next to it. So Promo West is right next to it. This is an outdoor concert venue right next to, it's on this side, and there's the baseball stadium there, okay? And of course, the Blue Jackets, the whole nationwide arena area. This is the old Moline Plow building. They actually made plows there back in the early 1900s. Most of these properties were contaminated and went through the brownfield as part of developing the hockey arena. So let me get into this one. This is one that I worked on early on, and it became a metro park. So this is Whittier Peninsula. There's downtown Columbus. There's this is the Scioto River, has a sharp bend in it. There's the peninsula. Whittier Street runs right along here. And This is an old industrial area. This is a warehouse. This was the old Lazarus Stores warehouse right there. Columbus School District bought it then, and they used it. This is the impound lot for the city of Columbus. And I had when we first worked on this, Coleman was the mayor, and Mayor Coleman had he wanted this to be waterfront property, real estate, okay? Walking type community. That was the big vision. So we had a meeting with his staffers. We go out and we do our due diligence on this. We do the phase 1, we do the phase 2. Turns out this whole area here was the original Columbus landfill. Now I got to go in to Mayor Coleman's office and say, it's a landfill. You can't really build on it unless you dig it all up and put it somewhere else. And that's millions and millions of dollars. That was the end of the whole housing idea. But because people decided this is too valuable a real estate just to walk away from it, they started thinking about what can we do with it. So here's 1994, before any redevelopment began. And I'll just go through what was there. Well, there's a railroad yard. The Ohio Hocking Railroad had its terminal right there. It had a repair yard to fix engines, repair cars, things like that. The city dump that I already talked about, there was a concrete plant there was a petroleum storage facility, the 2 warehouses I referenced, the city's impound lot, which was unique to itself. They patrolled that with rifles, with guns, because people like to try to break in to get their cars without paying for them, to take them back out. Yeah, it was probably next to a prison. That was probably the most high security place I ever worked at. And then there were small manufacturing companies. So there's the impound lot. There's the Lazarus warehouse. I'm going to point out the water tower. This is inside the warehouse. You can see the condition of the building. There was a lot of asbestos in there. The roof was already gone. You can see the daylight of the structure, the front of it there. This was another one of the manufacturing buildings. Do we think we might have an environmental release there? Yeah. And then what else was there? Homeless camps. There were 400 homeless people living there. This guy had a very friendly dog, and he was a very nice guy. That was his home. He had a mailbox. He got his mail delivered there, okay? So they had to relocate all those people. There was a lot of deprecative behavior there as well. You had illegal dumping, like this car that was dropped off. Graffiti and vandalism, which usually is related to gang activities. Illegal sexual conduct. It wasn't, I mean, you can see right there is one of the mattresses. Prostitutes were using those out in the open. And of course, drug abuse and sales. Not exactly a good neighborhood, right? So what's there now? Well, it's a Metro Park. And the Metro Park takes a lot of effort in forcing to make sure that it doesn't go back to what it used to be. Because like they'll tell you if you talk to them, and I take students down there all the time and I get to talk sidebar with some of the Metro Park wardens, and the thing that worries them the most is if there's a shooting down there, people don't come back, okay? So they're very concerned about those type of things, and they patrol it heavily. So this is the Metro Park. Let me just try to show you. It's bird watching. So that was the tower. They actually put 2 decks on it to do bird watching. Water feature that they encourage kids to go in here and wade in the mud and try to find the turtles, etc. Lots of walking paths. A fitness course where you can flip your tires and crawl over the trees and run through the tires and that type of stuff. Volleyball courts, more of the obstacle course. Picnic shelters, more trails. So let me give you kind of a comparison. What did it look like before? And again, this took 20 years to get it to what it is today, in a process that involved Metro Parks, Grange Insurance, and Audubon, the Audubon Society. Them all working together to try to come up with a vision for this. So this is where this building existed, right here. That's one of the monitoring wells we put in on the first round of phase 1. Now, because there's residual contamination, they let that grow as prairie grass. That discourages people from wandering in there. The contamination is not so bad that it's going to kill anything, but you just don't want people wandering in there. So you don't mow that. You don't make that accessible. You let nature do what nature does, okay? These open areas, this is part of the impound lot, right here. So this would have been covered with cars. There's the tower. There's the tower. So you can see how they made a climbing wall. Water feature, okay? Again, this one does have some residual contamination in it. So again, no mowing around it. They don't really try to encourage you to go in there and play around, all right? This is what it looked like before. Okay. This is the auto impound lot. This round building here, they had someone stationed up there with an automatic rifle. That was part of the security. So that you actually went through the gates right there. We had drill rigs and stuff in here collecting samples. So you can see what it looks like now. They just use this building. I think City of Columbus uses that building for like a maintenance shed. And then the engineering controls, okay? These wetlands were constructed in conjunction with the environmental remediation efforts, and the following covenants are in effect for both humans and pets. No contact, consumption, swimming, fishing, or wading in this wetland is allowed, and that is a sign that's in front of this, okay? And by not mowing it, you kind of discourage people from going in there and nosing around. The other part is this is the floor of the warehouse. There was contamination under the floor, so we let the floor in place. It's a barrier between the people that could be exposed using that and the contamination. And then they expanded the parking lots. So there's the original floor, and you expand this parking lot to help cover that up, okay? And of course, Audubon put in a gold certified LEED center. You can see there's a solar panel. They have these south-facing windows with the shade over top. In the summer, this will actually shade the windows so that they don't get too much sunlight in. And then in the winter, the sun actually hits the windows and gives you passive heating and lighting on it as well. Natural wood, no stain, no varnish on it. On the outside, the rain chains, the rain gardens here and here, all part of that. And of course, this is walking trails, and this is heading up to, and they have these big windows. This is the north-facing one, but they have a lot of bird feeders out there so that people can sit and actually bird watch on it. And so what do you do when you go to Whittier? The Audubon Center, bird watching, walking, wall climbing, exercising, bark park. They have a bark park there. You can be outdoors, and it's walking distance and connected by the bike path of downtown Columbus to the park. So it's very accessible. Okay. All right. Now, I work at Otterbein. Otterbein has its own little brownfield. I'll go in this one in just a little bit of detail. So Otterbein has kind of a characteristic major, equine science, okay? And they have national champion riding teams there as well. And it's a big draw. We get more out-of-state students in equine major than any other major. It's that popular. So in 1962, the Kilgore Company, if you remember cap guns that had the little red ribbon on them, Kilgore made them. They were based in Westerville. Kilgore in 1941 was one of the companies that was given a federal contract to produce munitions for the war effort. So they had this farm that at the time when they developed the farm, it was out in the middle of nowhere, and they made incendiary bombs there. Those are the same bombs, part of the bombs that were used when they bombed Tokyo. Okay, so if you remember the Tokyo bombing mission right after Pearl Harbor, some of those bombs were actually made at this facility. So it has quite a bit of legacy to it. This is a 1952 photo. These are Quonset huts. This is a materials processing facility, and this is a disposal area down here. And this is also a disposal area right there. The Quonset huts took the explosives and the chemicals that made them burn. They took them from here and they assembled them into bombs in the Quonset huts. The reason they did the Quonset huts spread out like that is if you had an accident, you didn't take out all of them. And they scraped up all the soil and they made berms around the Quonset huts to deflect the explosion upward instead of outward. And there were numerous deaths and numerous explosions while they were processing there. Well, I framed this area, there's the overall property, This went through the brownfield program, and that is the new equine facility. And it is quite a nice facility. I'll brag on it because it is definitely top of the line facility. But this piece back here, we're still working on how to clean that up. Okay? So this part was okay, made it through the VAP program, got a no further action. Otterbein built a facility in 2009. Still working back here. There's got to be a lot of soil taken out back there and taken off site. I know I talked a lot about Columbus, so let's do a little bit of Cleveland for those of you in the northern side. The Browns are planning on leaving downtown. When I first heard about this, I thought it was kind of flash in the pan, but then I went to a conference, EPA conference about a month ago, and this was actually one of the sessions they had talking about this. This is the old Ford facility. There's Cleveland Hopkins. It's going to be a big brownfield project. It's already underway. And the intent is to have the stadium here. So why did they pick that? Why not stay up at Lakefront? Why not stay in downtown? Well, there's money and taxes. You got to play that into it as well. But the other part of it is to get funding for brownfield redevelopment, you have to show how things are in place to make it successful, okay? Well, you have an interstate right here. There's 71, so you can get people in and out. You have RTA Rapid Station right here. You can bring people from downtown on the train and get them to games and get them back out again, okay? You have the airport, because you're going to fly other teams in, and it's easy for them to get across the street. And you got a big open space that once they take this building down, this is already raised and gone, and once they take this building down, you've got a lot of space for parking and ancillary materials. So it has all those wind spikes that if you're applying for federal and state money for a brownfield site, it has all those wind spikes tied to it, okay? So that's one of the reasons why a property like this would be selected. Okay, well, that's my presentation. Hopefully I kept you awake. Any questions? Yeah. He's come up with a microphone. So.
Could you comment on the adequacy of our current environmental laws in preventing future brownfields?
Yeah. If you look at the existing laws, and Ohio actually is ahead of most states because when an industry closes in Ohio, you have to go through what's known as a cessation of regulated operations closure. In most states, you could just shutter a factory and leave and let the chemicals and everything behind. In Ohio, Ohio EPA comes in and inspects the facility to make sure you've cleaned it to where it's not going to have a release. The fact that lenders won't touch a contaminated property is probably the best. The rules are there. You need somebody to essentially enforce. And you find the lending institutions are probably better than Ohio EPA. Don't quote me on that. But they're probably better than Ohio EPA in making sure that contamination doesn't get glossed over. Because they will. Yeah. They will be perceived as the deep pocket and they'll be pulled into it. And if you work with lending institutions in their due diligence, you'll find out they're very serious about it. Yeah. Right. And that all comes back to that Maryland Bank and Trust that went to the Supreme Court. When they found them guilty and liable, the lending industry started a whole new trend of doing due diligence.
When you remove contaminated earth from a site, where does it go, and is it remediated?
It can be remediated, depending on what it is. Most times it's going to a landfill, a permitted landfill, that would have a liner and be monitored, yeah.
Just speaking to that future issue with the recent Chevron decision, will that take anything that the EPA tells us to do? Like you said, the Ohio EPA is pretty good here, but won't companies just say that the EPA is an agency and they can't create regulations or detailed regulations about new types of things that can cause problems going forward? I mean, it sounds like it
That's-
just takes all of the regulation and shuts it down.
Yeah, I've been pretty close to the PFAS issue here in the past couple of years. That's the Teflon, waterproofing, fire suppression stuff. And of course, July 8th was the first day that water regulations went in place with that. And we're probably, I mean, those type of things get very complicated, and they're probably going to stay in the courts for quite a period of time. I don't know that I can speculate as to how the Chevron decision, how that all affects it. Yeah.
I have a question about East Palestine,
Okay.
the train wreck. Will that community ever fully recover, and is it cleaned up? Now, people say it is, and the people are going to be safe, sound, and forever, but is that really going to be the case?
Remember when I went through the definition of brownfields and I said perceived environmental impacts? I'm not sure East Palestine will ever get past the perceived. The data coming back, and I have friends who are working out there. I haven't worked on it at all, but I have several friends who are working out there. In fact, some of them are still working out there. At one point in time, they had 500 consultants working on that site. The data comes back saying it's clean. It meets standards. It's part of the psychology of whether or not you feel it's safe. And the other thing, you know, I've been asked before when I've talked to other groups, and they said, should they have burnt that chemical off? And my response is, I'm glad I wasn't ever put in a position where I would have to make that kind of decision, because you let it blow up, you could have major loss of life. I mean, that's a big bomb. So you burn it off, you get residual contamination. It's kind of a no-win.
With the recent considerations about groundwater and everything, as a homeowner, what would you recommend best for a homeowner to do? Like, would reverse osmosis be the best thing or something like that?
Reverse osmosis is what I would recommend. Test the water and see what's in it, the raw water. See what's in it. We're talking about on-lot well or city, okay? If you're really concerned, now if you're on city water and their pipes are well maintained and they keep the flint issue from occurring by neutralizing the leads and things like that, I really wouldn't worry on a public water supply. Homeowner well, particularly if you're a rural area and you have on-lot septic, you know, I would test the well, because you might be, the nitrates and the coliform bacteria may be a bigger issue. And then you have places like in the Carolinas where, because of the metavolcanics, they have naturally occurring arsenic in them. And they have pyrite, and the pyrite tends to make an acid, which makes the arsenic soluble. If I lived in an area like that, I would really pay attention to it. There, reverse osmosis would be my go-to. For the most part, the filtration you need, the Brita-type filters are good enough. So whatever may break through on a city, a Brita-type filter would probably be good enough to take care of that.
Thank you for your presentation. Are you familiar with the Ravenna Arsenal in Trumbull County?
A little bit.
Well, about, I think, maybe 15 years ago, they were going to just burn it off. They were going to, that was one of their solutions. They were going to just burn it off.
Done that.
And there was a woman in Wisconsin who had lived near an arsenal that they had done that to. And she got the people around in Trumbull County. So they didn't do that. Now they made it into an Air National Guard base, and there's lots of men there, weekend after weekend, men and women both. So I'd never read where there was any remediation done.
One of my colleagues from Otterbein does ecological assessments, and he has done a couple of contracts for Ohio EPA. And I mean, he and I have never talked in detail about it, but he's never found anything really anomalous there. And if somebody organized to protest that, I mean, that's exactly what happened at Love Canal. Lois Gibbs organized the community to finally get it federal attention. And sometimes that's what it takes.
Great.
Ohio and many other states have a long history of coal fly ash generation and disposal. Can you speak to that issue a little bit? Have you been involved at all in those remediation efforts?
There's a whole new set of federal regulations that went in place, I think the late 20-teens. It was after the one big failure, and the one in Tennessee, and then shortly after there was another one in North Carolina. And North Carolina, actually, their DEQ set a model forward for monitoring them and ultimately closing them out. And the federal government actually adopted the similar type, and that's all in place. So I think they're in a 10-year window to assess them and then eventually have them all closed out. So like the ones along the river, yeah, there is a plan in place for that.
Are you able to speak to the dumping grounds for construction versus residential dumping grounds and how we can create more of them without taking up our farming land? Our cities like Columbus is exponentially growing, and we are using spaces that probably shouldn't have been incorporated. Okay, I'll just let you go from there. Thank you.
I'm a big fan of redeveloping brownfields. I mean, that's one of the reasons I do this talk. I think it's almost a crime to go out and buy a farm and turn it into something that's then developed. So, I mean, I will openly say what Intel is doing down in Columbus, there are places probably in Columbus that they could have done that rather than going out to the farming community and doing that level of development. Because now it's not just Intel, it's all the associated industry out there as well. So I think public protest is probably the one thing. And if there are ways that you can create more incentives, I really didn't talk about the VAP incentive. The VAP incentive for a developer is the diminished value of the property is what they pay taxes on for 10 years post-development. So if they take a property and they improve it by $5–10 million, it stays at that original tax rate for 10 years. And that's really their incentive to do a brownfield. So if it's so expensive that the tax rebate doesn't offset it, they don't happen.
These great big, huge landfills we see going in, like the one down by Columbus and so forth, is there any hope for those? What will eventually happen with that? Do we just end up burying ourselves or what?
Okay, recycling. I think the day is coming, maybe not in my lifetime, in my students' lifetime, those are going to become recycle centers. They're going to mine them. If nothing else, there's a lot of BTUs of energy, and we now have the air technology to burn it without putting it out the stack. And since we need critical metals to make electronic devices, there's so much of that in a landfill that you literally could mine it like they mine coal. That day is coming. That day is coming.
Talk about fracking.
Mm-hmm.
Does the EPA know what they're dumping down into these wells to release the gas?
They know what's put into the permit process. How's that for an answer? I mean, if they're not disclosing it, you know, keep in mind, when they developed the hazardous waste laws, industry had to tell EPA what they considered hazardous. It's not like EPA had a magic list and said, if it's on this list. Right. You had to self-report. Yeah. Well, Teflon, classic example. If you've never seen the movie Dark Water, watch Dark Water. It'll open your eyes.
Is there a new combination of materials that we're creating in our industries that are volatile that we don't know about and need to be sort of headed off
I think
the
we're
path?
always going to do that. Yeah. I think the day's coming when these things that we all carry around, we're going to look at them and say, ooh, maybe we shouldn't have.
Thanks. I just had one comment to add. I was in this business for a bunch of years, and a year or two ago, I read the book called Tom's River. It's a Pulitzer Prize win. If you ever want to understand the history of the waste laws, groundwater contamination, and how people look at it, the book is excellent.
It's nice because it ties in with Jan Slickman, because that's where he kind of came out of his bankruptcy.
It was just amazing. And I'm originally grew up in that part of New Jersey, and you could see up until the late 70s, a lot of people didn't consider dumping anything on the ground or groundwater contamination as a problem.
It was acceptable.
It wasn't illegal.
It was acceptable. Yeah.
I went to, with my bosses, I went to magistrate courts to try to convince the judges that groundwater was even covered under contamination laws, under water contamination laws, because there wasn't specific groundwater contamination laws yet. So it's just amazing. Yeah. And we all benefited economically from some of those things.
Yeah. Like
in Tom's River, a lot of people in the town of Tom's River didn't want to close the plant because they worked there.
Well, and the part I liked about that book was the chapters when they explain the synthetic dye industry and how toxic it is, but at the same time, how many people think of your colorful clothing that you're wearing is a byproduct of a toxic process. So.
You've been speaking about the EPA. How effective do you think the EPA is? I've heard that it's been pretty much diminished by, I don't know, I suppose different industry and people who don't like regulation and don't want regulation, aside from the Chevron decision, which sounds like it'll take things down quite a bit. I mean, has the EPA been effective in the recent past, or have they been kind of emasculated?
I'm going to be careful how I answer that. I think one of the biggest problems EPA, federal or state, has, there are too many sites, not enough people. So on really complicated sites, it takes up a lot of their time, and the right decisions don't always get made as a relationship to those sites. And I think a lot of the effective enforcement falls by the wayside. And I don't want to slam EPAs, because if you think about the workload they have, the number of sites, and some of them are pretty hostile sites, it's a tough position. It's a really tough position. So, and when the attorneys get involved, it gets really complicated. Yeah, corporate attorneys, attorneys of interest. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, one of the most difficult meetings I ever had, I was hired by BP to do the due diligence on the Lima refinery, and at the time I was doing that work, the decision was made to close the Lima refinery. Now, what ended up happening is somebody came in and bought it in the 11th hour and kept it open. But I had to go to the public meetings in the Lima High School gym, stand in front of them and explain stuff that we were finding, because BP wanted to be forthcoming about what the environmental impacts were. And when you have a bunch of union workers who look at you and basically say, you're the SOB that's taken my job, it's not a lot of fun. So when you have these situations, and that's what I tell my students too, the science is the easy part. The people issues are the really tough parts.
That was a nice closing, but I have another question for you. So in the equestrian center, are the horses able to go into the back pasture there or into the woods? No, not even that. All right.
No, and when that gets cleaned up, it's going to be similar to that Whittier Peninsula example. It'll be, because they're going to let residual contamination, but they're going to make it walking paths. I think they're going to do a perimeter riding because the perimeter's okay on it. If I get my way, it's going to become a solar field, and we're going to take the equine facility off the grid. And I keep promoting that. You heard it, you heard it, you heard it, you heard it.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you have any programs or educational more talks or things that local citizens who don't have a science degree can do to get involved? Whether that's here or Columbus, we're based in Columbus.
I get asked to do this type of talks quite regularly, yeah. So, and I do different topics, but this is one I'm kind of passionate about because I think we need to quit wasting land. So.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.